G'day, Dr. Karl here with Shirtloads of Science, and I'm very lucky to be here with the economist, not an economist, but the economist, Richard Dennis, and he wrote this article for The Monthly called What the Government Thinks You're Worth, or Our Nation's Economists Have a Price on Your Head, Dead or Alive. And then he pointed me in a direction of reading an official government document called Best Practice Regulation Guidance Note, The Value of a Statistical Life. So welcome to talking about the value of a life, Dr. Richard. Look, thank you very much for coming on again.
Thank you.
I don't know where to start, so how about I start with this. In early 2021, with regard to COVID-19, in February-ish, there were 112 million people infected and 2.5 million people dead. What is a human life worth? Take it away. You know much more about it than I do. Where do we start?
Let's start by admitting something, that economists don't really have much expertise when it comes to valuing human life. But unlike every other profession, we're kind of willing to have a crack. So the reason people will ask economists questions like, what's a human life worth, is that unlike nearly all other humans, we'll come up not just with an answer, but an answer to a few decimal places.
Oh, it must be very good if you've got a few decimal places. Do you put in error bars, or is that a dirty question to ask?
No, we don't like error bars. Economists don't like to admit to errors at all. People confuse precision with accuracy. We know that. That's why we go to a few decimal places. So, what's a human life worth? I mean, we can ask ourselves questions like, how much money was someone going to earn while they were alive?
Oh,
and
yeah.
That kind of makes some sense to people, except when you start saying, well, what about people who don't work? Are they worthless? Is someone who takes time out of the labour market in their 50s to care for their elderly parents, did they become worthless when they just started to care for other people rather than earn money for themselves? We could value a human life not at your income, but kind of the average income say, of people in the country. But of course, that means that we think people in Australia are worth a lot more than people who live in Bangladesh or India. We could ask people, what do you think your life's worth? Or here's the weird one, economists have a nice phrase called willingness to pay. How much money are you willing to pay to not die? And indeed, how much money are you willing to pay to keep me alive? So economists have got a whole bunch of tools, methods that we can play with. But to be crystal clear, while we're willing to have a crack, while we're willing to put decimal places on our estimates, we don't really know. And once you take the debate away from something abstract, like what's the value of an average life, and replace it with something specific, like what's the value of your mum's life, we see that we get radically different answers to those questions. So valuing human life is important, but how you do it and who gets to do it, these are kind of questions that we usually keep secret from people.
Well, in your article in The Monthly, you raise this point, we spend lots to prevent deaths from terrorism or shark attacks, but can't afford to work against or militate against more common deaths, such as from family violence or diabetes or Indigenous people in custody. So it shows that we're being a bit irrational. We value some forms of death more highly. And my understanding is that in Australia, more people die from ladder accidents each year than from terrorism. Mate, I'm waiting for the ladder police to start knocking on the houses.
Oh, look, far more people. Look, I mean, think about the number of people who drown, for example. We don't ban swimming. We don't lock up the beaches. We just kind of say, oh, well, swimming's a bit dangerous and, people take a risk. So we know that a whole bunch of people are going to die from climbing on the roof of their house, going for a swim, driving their car. But the thought that someone might die in a terrorist attack, we respond quite differently to that. We take for granted that we all have to queue for hours at airports to screen against very low risks of something bad happening. That takes a lot of time, takes a lot of money. Similarly, we spend tens of millions of dollars protecting ourselves from the very unlikely event of a shark killing someone. And of course, it's tragic when it happens. I don't mean to trivialise the loss of someone dying from shark attack, but the families of people in ladder accidents are just as traumatised. But as a society, we'll spend tens of millions of dollars trying to prevent a death from shark attack, but we won't spend tens of millions of dollars to install dialysis machines in regional and remote areas of Australia. And as a result, we know people die. Economists like to put numbers on things, but we look away when we look at the simple things we could do to save lives versus the very expensive things we do to save some other lives.
Now, you mentioned if you apply a certain form of, quote, economic rationalism, I'm making up those quotes myself, it makes sense for wealthy countries to dump their toxic waste in poor countries.
Oh, yeah, look, there's something called a famous document. I really encourage people to Google this because if you just hear me say it, you won't believe it's true. But, Google the Summers Memo, named after a guy called Lawrence Summers, who was an economics advisor to Bill Clinton, a very senior academic, one of the most kind of prestigious economists in the world. And he wrote something called the Summers Memo, which explains in very clear language for an economist why it makes perfectly good sense for rich countries to dump toxic waste in poor countries. And I encourage people to read the memo, the Summers Memo. To summarise, what he says is, look, toxic waste is going to kill people. We know it's going to kill people. So let's not pretend that it's not going to kill people. The question is which people it kills. So do we think it should kill rich people in rich countries or poor people in poor countries? And once you're honest enough to admit the waste is going to kill someone, it follows that you might as well have a debate about who to kill. And from Lawrence Summers' point of view, it's, quote, unarguable that it's better to kill the poor people in poor countries, in part because their incomes are lower, but in part because their life expectancy is lower. They're going to die young anyway. So, really, if someone has to die, according to Professor Summers, why not them? Now, people shy away from questions like that, rightly. We'd like to say, oh, that's immoral. Okay, if it's immoral, is it immoral to make the waste that kills the people? Or is it just immoral to have a debate about who it should kill?
Now, in your article, you also talk about the Australian Pharmaceutical Benefits Advisory Committee and a decision with regard to meningococcal disease that led to an very unfortunate outcome for one Australian person. Can you take us to explain the background of what is the Australian Pharmaceutical Benefits Scheme and how it ended up bad for somebody with a certain type of meningococcal disease?
Yeah, so that same logic that I just spelled out in its full horror, that rightly everyone thinks, oh, that can't be right. Well, there's a brutal honesty to the question, and that says, well, sometimes we have to make hard decisions, and when we're going to make hard decisions, what's the best way to make them? In Australia, we have something called the Pharmaceutical Benefits Scheme, the PBS, and it means that when we go to the chemist, after we go to the doctor and the doctor says, well, you need these antibiotics or you need this medicine, when you go and get it from the chemist, you get it by world standards at a pretty low price. And that's because the government subsidises the medicine so that we can afford to buy them. So the medicine might be very expensive, it's just not that expensive for you and I. But the drug companies know this. The drug companies know that, well, if you and I don't actually have to pay the full price, then we don't care how much it costs. So when our government on our behalf is negotiating with the drug companies, the government, doing an important job, is saying to the drug companies, well, no, we just can't pay as much as you want us to pay. That's too expensive. Your medicine isn't that valuable. Your drugs aren't that good. So there's this whole negotiation that takes place between the government, the Australian government, and the drug companies that want to sell new drugs. As a result of that negotiation, what often happens is our government, our elected government, says, well, we're not going to pay that much. If your drug costs that much, it might save some lives in Australia, but if we multiply the lives saved by $1 value per life, your drug's too expensive. We're not going to list it. As I write about in that essay, there's a clear example of this where we've decided to not subsidise a vaccine for meningococcal B. And meningococcal B is quite a rare disease, but when people get it, it can cause them terrible injuries. Their body's response is, the loss of fingers, the loss of limbs, and possibly death. So people die because of this choice that we've made to not list a drug. Well, when I say Lawrence Summers said it makes sense to kill people in one country than another, everyone knows that's harsh and terrible. But when the Australian government decides that we can't afford to list every drug for subsidy, people die. And we don't know their names. The Parliament doesn't decide that a particular person with a particular name should die. But when we refuse to list a particular drug, we know that people will die. And if we didn't make those hard decisions, if we tried to list every drug on the pharmaceutical benefit scheme, then we'd all have to pay a lot more money for all of our medicine. So we do make hard choices, and those hard choices, unfortunately, sometimes come with very hard consequences.
Well, in this case, you talk about the meningococcal disease and the fact that we have vaccines for the varieties or strains labelled as A, C, Y and W, but not for B. And you talk about a case of a baby getting the B strain with all sorts of loss, but then had to be fed by a tube for the first 10 years of life, this kid, the poor thing, kidney transplant. How much did all of that cost, and would it have been cheaper once we add up all those costs to actually have made the B vaccine subsidised? Has anybody done that equation?
No is the short answer. But let me give you another example of exactly this. You're a medical doctor, Dr. Karl. If I have a bad car crash and I go through the windscreen of my car having broken most of my bones and ruptured quite a lot of organs, an ambulance will rush out, a helicopter might come and get me, there'll be paramedics on the ambulance, no expense will be spared picking me up. By the time I get to hospital, there'll be a team of surgeons waiting for me. They might operate on me for 24 hours. I might be in intensive care for a month. I might be in hospital for 6 months, and no one ever says, gee, this is getting a bit expensive. Richard's a nice bloke, but, how long are we going to keep him in here?
He's a nice bloke, but is he $20 million worth of nice bloke?
Yeah, exactly. Don't get me wrong. I love living in a rich country with a great public health system. I've had some bad accidents, none that bad, and I've been very well looked after. And during that process, no one stops the clock and says, Richard, can you afford any of this? Now, this is a wonderful thing, but this is how our medical system deals with trauma. So if I have an accident, then basically the doctors in hospital can write, it's a blank check. They'll just keep going. They'll look after me, and it's a wonderful, wonderful thing. But if I need particular medicine, if I need particular drugs to prolong my life, we go through a very rigorous cost-benefit analysis to figure out, well, Richard, yes, we could get you these very expensive drugs, but, that's $80,000 a year worth of drug, and, we're not even sure it's going to work, so, maybe not. Even in Australia, even in our own medical system, we have an incredible disparity between how we deal with the cost of treating trauma and how we deal with the cost of chronic illness. And, that's okay. It's a democracy. We're allowed to be inconsistent, but no one in intensive care in Australia is looking at the cost. Whereas in America, where they've got a private system where you need private health insurance, yeah, you better believe that the hospital will wonder whether they should keep treating you.
You pointed me at a document from the Australian government's Department of the Prime Minister and Cabinet. So this is pretty high up. The Office of Best Practice Regulation. And apparently around 2014, so can you bring us up to date, around 2014, the statistical value, or the value of a statistical life in Australia, was $4.2 million, and a value of a statistical life year was $182,000 in 2014 dollars. And firstly, I didn't quite understand that, because $182,000 called it 200,000. That's a fifth of a million. So you're worth $4 million. That's only 20 years. Don't you live for longer than that? And then secondly, has it been updated for 2021 and so forth?
A couple of good questions there. So firstly, let's be clear, the Australian Commonwealth Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet has a nice little memo, which again, anyone can Google, which is guidance for public servants on how to put a dollar value on a human life. So you might hear people say life is precious, or life is, you can't put a dollar value on, or it's incalculable. And, well, that's not true. The Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet has got a handy little memo, and they tell people what a life is worth. And yep, while the memo isn't updated every year, economists using that memo update it usually according to the CPI, the Consumer Price Index. So we increase that gradually. Yeah, it's a little ready reckoner. There's a table in the memo to help people do all these things, and gives you a lump sum value for a human life. It's up around $4.5 million now, or an annual life at around $195,000. The reason that the lump sum price is kind of less than life expectancy times the annual price, it's a little bit complicated, but I'm 50 years old. My life today is kind of valued at, well, how many years do they think I've got left? So the 4.5 million is in part what's the average Australian got left in them. But also economists have this very, very strange thing, but we do give hints in the names of things. We have something called the discount rate, and economists think that things that happen today are much more valuable than things that happen in the future. So if I offered you $100 today or $100 in 10 years' time, you'd probably say, I'll have the $100 today. But if I said, I'll give you $100 today or $1 million in 10 years' time, yeah, you'd probably take the million. So economists use something called the discount rate to figure out kind of how much people tend to prefer getting stuff today. That's okay when it comes to, you'll see shops saying pay less now or pay more in the future. That's quite a common thing. But what we don't realise with things like the discount rate is that economists think that a kid born in 100 years' time is worth far less than you or I, because, we've got to discount their life, because it's in the future. And this is a real problem when it comes to things like tackling climate change, because the economic models that say, look, a lot of people are going to die from climate change, no one doubts that, but they're not going to die for ages. So should you and I be inconvenienced today so that someone else doesn't die in the future? Well, according to economists, maybe not. All of these numbers, as I said at the beginning, are pretty spurious. They come from some pretty strange assumptions about what we think is valuable in a human life.
Now, we've had this 2.5 million people die from COVID-19 thingy, and I came across this paper, and it's entitled Pandemics Depress the Economy, Public Health Interventions Do Not, Evidence from the 1918 Flu. And what they showed was that, if anything, these non-pharmaceutical interventions, where the economy's going to shut down, so you just shut down anyway, people can't go out and the economy falls over, so you're not giving drugs or vaccines, trying to reduce the death rate during a pandemic by non-drugs. They say that non-pharmaceutical interventions are associated with better economic outcomes. Now, this has been looking at stuff from the 1918 flu pandemic. Is it too early for similar sort of research to be carried out for the one that we're in right here, right now?
Look, certainly there seem to be parallels. It is a little bit early, but let's sort of break it down a little bit. Early on in the crisis, we had some people saying, look, say it's only going to kill 1 or 2% of the population, and look, they're old and most of them are probably going to die soon anyway. Why should the rest of us be inconvenienced to save a few lives? So at a really coarse level, you could say, well, all right, what's 1% of the population times an estimate of the value of human life? You get a big number. And then you think, well, what's the cost of shutting down the economy, the job loss, etc., the inconvenience? You get a big number. And, at some point you think, oh, well, it's just a bit expensive to save 1 or 2% of the population's life. You could think like that, and some people do think like that. Personally, I don't. I actually think the point of living in a rich country, the wonderful thing about living in a rich country is we can actually help save each other's lives and have much happier, healthier lives because of all the wealth. It seems a bit weird to me that you want to get rich so you can be happy, and then you have people saying, well, we have to die so that we can stay rich. It seems a bit weird to me. But that kind of, do we protect the economy or should we protect health, that kind of binary choice has been shown by data like you just described, but increasingly a lot of contemporary data that says there's actually not really much of a trade-off, if any trade-off at all, because in the countries where they didn't lock down, a lot of people died, but the economies were still miserable for all sorts of reasons, including people didn't want to go out and get an infectious disease that could kill their mum. Even if the law didn't make them stay at home, they stayed at home anyway. I think what the data is increasingly showing is that countries like Australia that shut down hard and shut down early got very low death rates, and economies that sprang back faster than economies like in the US where they didn't shut down and, enormous tragic numbers of people have died, and their economy's still dragging along the bottom as well. As an economist, I'd say two things. If saving hundreds of thousands of people's lives was expensive, I'd do it anyway. But the data shows that it's not that expensive to save hundreds of thousands of people's lives, because even if you kind of let the virus rip, the economy goes terribly anyway. But that's a moral judgment. There's no right answer there, but personally and professionally, countries like Australia and New Zealand have not just done things that have protected human health. They have, but I actually think they've done things that have set our economy up to do better than it otherwise would.
What would you recommend people read to learn more about this concept of the value of the human life and following on from this field? And also, how can people follow you and your fine work in the future?
Look, I'd really encourage people to Google the Summers Memo. It really is jaw-dropping for economists and non-economists alike. And if you just type Summers Memo in, you'll find it. It's got its own Wikipedia page. Okay. It's a very famous document.
Go for the Summers Memo. Look, you quote something, this can't be true, you must have made this up. I've always thought, goes Summers, that the underpopulated countries in Africa are vastly underpolluted. You didn't make that up. That's really in the memo, is it?
That is literally what he wrote.
Okay.
And in his defence, there is a compelling logic to that. Not a logic that I accept. I don't. I actually think it's morally wrong. But if you accept that we're going to create enormous amounts of dangerous pollutants, and if you accept they have to be buried somewhere and they're going to harm someone, Lawrence Summers is saying, I think they should be poor people who don't earn much and who are probably going to die younger than us. I do not agree with his conclusion. There is an honesty in his analysis that confronts us all.
Okay, so firstly, read the Summers Memo. It's got its own Wikipedia page. And how else should they do some homework so they're up to speed?
If people want to follow myself on Twitter, RDNS_TAI. TAI stands for The Australia Institute. That's my employer. All of our research is freely available there. Facebook, same, pretty easy to find. But if people want to learn more about this stuff, then, the essay you referred to in the monthly, the memo written by the Department of Premier and Cabinet on the value of human life, all of this stuff, none of it's top secret, all of it's freely available, but it's kind of hidden in full sight. And in turn, the hard decisions that we have to make, and in fact the horrible decisions we sometimes make, they're hidden in full sight, and we can look into them if we want.
Okay, thank you very much, Richard, and thank you so much for enlightening me again in this field about which I know pretty close to nothing, economics. Thank you very much, and bye-bye.
Thank you, Dr. Karl.
40 years after my very first story on climate change, I'm still on the case, but now I've decided to write a book on it. It's Dr. Karl's little book of climate change science, and it will explain how we got into this mess and how we can get out of it. You'll find out who did the early research into climate change and then spent billions of dollars trying to cover it up and why they did that. You'll find out how greenhouse gases trap 400,000 Hiroshima atom bombs worth of heat every day, and, even best, how we can stop and even reverse global warming. Dr. Karl's little book of climate change science. Get this book while it's not hot. Yes, we can help stop global warming and improve the lives of current and future generations. It's available as a paperback, ebook and audiobook from your local bookshop, library or online. Shirtloads of Science is washed,